May 12, 1989, 7:36 in the morning, a woman named Early Davis steps outside her front door on Duffy Street in San Bernardino, California, to grab her morning newspaper just like she does every single day. And then the ground starts shaking. She looks up toward the railroad tracks that run on an elevated grade above her neighborhood and sees something that should not be possible. 6 locomotives and 69 fully loaded freight cars, thousands of tons of steel and cargo hurtling down Cajon Pass at 110 miles per hour on a stretch of track that is rated for 35. The engineer is still at his controls, but there is nothing he can do anymore because the brakes burned out 15 minutes ago, somewhere up on that mountain. The train hits a curve, launches off the elevated track bed, and plows straight through 7 houses like they are made of cardboard. 4 people do not make it out, 2 of them children who were still asleep in their beds when several thousand tons of locomotive came crashing through their walls. And here is where it gets worse, because 13 days later, while crews are still cleaning up the wreckage, a gasoline pipeline buried underneath the tracks ruptures right where the train went off, and suddenly Duffy Street explodes into a fireball that shoots 300 feet into the air and burns for nearly 7 hours because a faulty valve downstream keeps feeding fuel into the flames. 2 more people gone, 11 more homes destroyed, and a community that will spend decades trying to recover. This is Cajon Pass in Southern California, and this is just one of the train routes we're going to talk about today. Cajon Pass sits between the San Bernardino Mountains and the San Gabriel Mountains, and it is one of the busiest freight corridors in the entire country. We are talking 40 trains a day, sometimes more, grinding their way up and down a 3% grade that seems perfectly manageable on paper, until you are actually sitting in the cab of a locomotive trying to hold back 8,000 tons of freight with nothing but air brakes and dynamic braking. The pass has been claiming trains for over a century, and the scary thing is that it is still doing it today. The 1989 disaster happened because of a perfect storm of human error and mechanical failure. The clerks back in Mojave had miscalculated the weight of the train, reported it at 6,000 tons when it was actually pushing close to 9,000. That difference might not sound like much to someone who does not work on railroads, but when you are trying to calculate how much braking power you need to get down a mountain, 3,000 tons is the difference between a controlled descent and a runaway that nobody can stop. On top of that, several of the locomotives had faulty dynamic brakes, and nobody bothered to tell the head-end crew about it. So when the helper engineer in the rear realized they were picking up speed and hit the emergency brakes in a panic, he actually made things catastrophically worse because emergency brakes cut the dynamic braking system entirely. From that moment on, there was absolutely nothing anyone could do. The NTSB investigation found that Southern Pacific's training program for engineers did not include a single word about how to regain control of a runaway train. Not one page in any manual. These men were sent down a mountain with thousands of tons of freight behind them, and nobody ever taught them what to do if things went wrong. And Cajon Pass kept taking trains after that. December 1994, another runaway slammed into the back of a Union Pacific coal train. February 1996, 2 more crew members gone when a manifest train carrying hazardous materials exploded into flames near Cajon Junction. The toxic smoke was so bad, they had to close Interstate 15 for 30 hours. But what happened on Duffy Street after the 1989 disaster tells you everything about how these tragedies play out for the people who have to live with them. The pipeline that ruptured 13 days after the derailment had been inspected during the cleanup, but only in short segments around places where train wreckage had landed on top of it. Nobody bothered to excavate the entire length through the crash site. Nobody ran a pressure test. And nobody noticed that a backhoe used to scoop up spilled cargo had gouged several gashes in the pipe. When the pipeline finally gave way on May 25th, the control room operators detected a sudden drop in pressure, but hesitated to act on it, and when they finally did, a check valve downstream that was supposed to stop the flow of fuel failed to close. So gasoline kept pouring back down the mountain into the fire for hours while the neighborhood burned. The residents who survived both disasters, the train and the fire, ended up dealing with ambulance-chasing lawyers who promised them riches and then disappeared with their settlement money. Some of them never recovered financially or emotionally, and the city eventually rezoned the lots closest to the tracks as open space so nobody would ever build houses there again. Now, let me take you to Thailand for a railway with a very different kind of history. You have probably heard of the bridge on the River Kwai. There is a famous movie about it that won a bunch of Academy Awards back in the 50s. But what actually happened on that railway is so much worse than anything Hollywood ever put on screen. Between 1942 and 1943, the Japanese military forced over 60,000 Allied prisoners of war and more than 200,000 Asian civilians to build a railway connecting Thailand to Burma. The purpose was strategic. Japan needed a supply line for its campaign in Southeast Asia because the sea routes had become too dangerous. So they decided to punch a railway through 415 kilometers of dense jungle, steep mountains, and rivers that flood completely during monsoon season. And they decided to do it in just 15 months using nothing but hand tools and human bodies. The conditions were beyond anything you can imagine sitting here in comfort. The workers were starved, beaten, worked to exhaustion in tropical heat, and ravaged by malaria, dysentery, and cholera that swept through the camps like wildfire. The most notorious section was called Hellfire Pass, a cutting through solid rock that is almost 250 feet long and over 80 feet deep. The prisoners worked on it around the clock, by torchlight after sunset, which is how it got its name. The flickering flames against the rock walls made it look like the entrance to someplace far worse than a construction site. By the time the railway was finished in October 1943, over 12,000 Allied prisoners had perished, and the civilian workers, mostly Tamils, Malays, Burmese, and Javanese laborers who had been promised wages and never received them, suffered even worse losses. The estimates for civilian casualties run as high as 90,000 people. The Japanese engineers who designed the railway had estimated it would take 5 years to build under normal conditions, and they did it in 15 months by treating human beings as disposable equipment. When a man collapsed from exhaustion or disease, they simply dragged him aside and put another body in his place. The railway earned its nickname because it was built on a foundation of bones, and that is not a metaphor. And here is what stays with you. After the war ended, most of the railway was dismantled. Today, tourists sit in comfortable seats, photograph the River Kwai, and roll over ground that soaked up more suffering than most battlefields. Staying in Thailand for a moment, imagine you are walking through an open-air market about 80 kilometers southwest of Bangkok. Vendors everywhere selling fresh fish, tropical fruits, vegetables piled high, Thai street food sizzling on grills. And then you hear a horn. Not a car horn, a train horn. Everyone around you suddenly springs into action like they have rehearsed this 1,000 times, because they have. Vendors start grabbing their produce off the tracks, pulling back their awnings, folding up their displays with practiced efficiency. And then a full-sized passenger train comes rolling straight through the middle of the market, so close to the stalls that the metal brushes against the goods on display. So close to the people that you could literally reach out and touch it if you were stupid enough to try. If you are standing in the wrong spot when that horn sounds, you have got about 30 seconds to flatten yourself against the wall before 300 tons of locomotive comes through. This is the Maeklong Railway Market, and it has been operating exactly like this since 1905. 8 times a day, every single day, a train passes through. The vendors know the schedule by heart because their grandparents knew it too. Vietnam had a similar setup in Hanoi, a famous street where trains pass between houses and cafes with tourists sitting inches from the tracks, and they had to shut it down in 2019 because tourists kept refusing to move out of the way. They would stand there taking photos while the train was bearing down on them because they wanted the perfect shot. The fact that Maeklong is still operating the way it always has says something about the line between danger and daily life being completely erased by a century of routine. The Pamban Bridge was India's first sea bridge when it opened in 1914. Over 2 kilometers across the ocean, supported by 145 concrete piers, connecting the mainland to Rameswaram Island. For 50 years, the bridge was a vital link carrying pilgrims and tourists and freight out to a little port town called Dhanushkodi at the very tip of the island. The Palk Strait where the bridge sits is known for high winds, strong tides, and cyclones that can appear with devastating speed. December 22, 1964, one of the most powerful storms ever recorded in the region came roaring through. Wind speeds approaching 280 kilometers per hour, storm surge over 7 meters. And at that moment, a passenger train was approaching Danushkodi, carrying somewhere between 115 and 200 people, depending on which records you trust. The exact number was never determined because so many passengers had boarded without tickets. The train never made it to the station. A massive wave struck the bridge and swept all 6 coaches into the sea. Everyone on board was lost. The town of Danushkodi was completely destroyed. Over 1,800 people perished that night, and the Indian government declared the entire town a ghost town, unfit for habitation. It has never been rebuilt. The railway line to Danushkodi was abandoned. The station sits there today as a crumbling ruin visited by tourists who want to see what is left. The Pamban Bridge itself had over 120 girders collapse in the storm, but they fixed it. Engineer E. Sridharan rebuilt the bridge in 45 days, and trains started running again within 2 months of the disaster. They are still running today, creeping across the century-old structure with the Indian Ocean churning below and the memory of 1964 hanging in the salt air. The White Pass and Yukon route is a narrow-gauge railway that runs from Skagway, Alaska, up through the mountains to Whitehorse in the Yukon. It was built during the Klondike Gold Rush starting in 1898, and when you see the route it takes, you understand why the original trail over these mountains was called the Dead Horse Trail. Thousands of pack animals perished trying to haul supplies over White Pass before the railroad was built. The terrain is that brutal. The railway climbs from sea level to almost 3,000 feet in just 20 miles. The grades hit nearly 4% in some sections, which is steep enough to make locomotive engineers sweat. The track clings to cliff sides, crosses gorges on wooden trestles that creak in the wind, and threads through tunnels blasted out of solid granite by men working with nothing but black powder and determination. September 2006. A work train carrying 8 cars loaded with gravel lost control on a steep grade near Bennett, British Columbia. The train became a runaway, hit speeds of over 70 kilometers per hour, and derailed on a curve that it was never going to make. One worker lost his life at the scene, and 3 others were seriously injured. The investigation found that the cars were overloaded, the brakes were operating at diminished capacity, and the crew had not been properly trained for that kind of weight on that kind of grade. July 2014, a tourist train with over 350 passengers aboard derailed near the White Pass summit because of a single broken throw rod at a switch. 23 people injured, treated for everything from bumps and bruises to head wounds that needed staples. The White Pass is still running today, carrying cruise ship passengers on scenic tours, and every time one of those trains starts climbing that grade, it is playing the same odds that trains have been playing up there for over 120 years. The Tren a las Nubes, the train to the clouds, is one of the highest railways in the world. At its peak, it reaches over 4,200 meters above sea level. That is nearly 14,000 feet. High enough that the air gets so thin, passengers sometimes need supplemental oxygen just to keep from passing out. The railway runs through 29 bridges, 21 tunnels, and uses a system of zigzags and switchbacks to gain altitude, because the grades would be impossible to climb with any conventional approach. The train literally goes forward, stops, reverses direction, and goes forward again, working its way up the mountainside in a pattern that looks insane, until you realize there was simply no other way to do it. Construction started in 1921 and took 27 years to complete. In 2005, a train stopped at 3,500 meters and could not be restarted no matter what the engineers tried. The passengers had to be evacuated by helicopter, which is not how anyone expects a scenic rail journey to end. In 2014, another train derailed at 4,000 meters, stranding 400 passengers in one of the most remote stretches of the Andes until rescue crews could reach them. Altitude sickness is a constant companion on these journeys. Tour operators hand out coca leaves and coca tea, but even with those, some passengers simply cannot handle the thin air. The most dramatic feature is the La Polverilla Viaduct, a curved steel bridge spanning a canyon at over 4,000 meters. When the train crosses it, passengers can look straight down into empty space. It is the highest railway viaduct in the world. In Ecuador, there is a section of track between the towns of Alayusi and Sabambe that drops 500 meters in just 12 kilometers. That is an absolutely insane gradient for a railway. Engineers in 1901 designed a series of switchbacks carved directly into a near-vertical rock face that locals called the Condor's Eyrie. The train zigzags down the mountain, reversing direction multiple times, clinging to ledges that look like they should not be able to support a bicycle, let alone a locomotive with passenger cars. The name Devil's Nose did not come from the difficulty of riding it. It came from the cost of building it. 4,000 workers were brought in for construction, many of them from Jamaica and Puerto Rico, promised wages that would never fully materialize. They worked with hand tools, blasting through rock, dealing with landslides and tropical diseases. By the time the Devil's Nose section was completed in 1908, an estimated 2,000 workers had lost their lives. That is half the workforce gone. For decades after it opened, passengers could ride on the roof of the train, which sounds romantic until you hear what happened. 2 Japanese tourists on their honeymoon were sitting on the roof when the train snagged a low-hanging cable. They did not make it. After that, roof riding was banned permanently. The Devil's Nose reopened as a tourist attraction, and the views are spectacular. But every time that train reverses direction on one of those switchbacks, hanging over a canyon that swallowed 2,000 lives during construction, you cannot help thinking about what it costs to put those rails there. February 3rd, 2023. A small town in eastern Ohio called East Palestine, right on the border with Pennsylvania. A Norfolk Southern freight train carrying 20 cars loaded with hazardous materials was rolling through town around 9 at night when an equipment failure caused 38 cars to jump the tracks. Vinyl chloride, butyl acrylate, ethylene glycol, the kind of stuff you really do not want spilling into your neighborhood. 2 days later, officials ordered a controlled release and burn of the vinyl chloride from 5 tank cars. The manufacturer had apparently told Norfolk Southern that the cars were not at risk of exploding. That information never made it to the fire chief who ordered the burn. So they vented over 100,000 gallons of vinyl chloride and set it on fire, sending a massive black mushroom cloud into the sky, visible for miles. Residents reported headaches, nausea, rashes. Fish floated to the surface in local streams. Pets and livestock got sick. Analysis of precipitation data suggested the pollution spread across portions of 16 states. 2 years later, the cleanup is still happening, and people in East Palestine still do not have a clear answer to the most basic question: is it safe to stay here? This was not a century ago. This was 2023 in a small American town with modern safety regulations supposedly in place. The Tehachapi Loop is probably the most famous spiral track in North America. Built because engineers in the 1870s faced an impossible problem. The pass was simply too steep for a straight track. The solution was a corkscrew. The track circles around a central hill, crosses over itself through a tunnel, and gains 77 feet in elevation over less than a mile. A train long enough will actually be crossing above its own rear cars as it spirals up the mountain. Built by hand, mostly by Chinese laborers, using picks, shovels, and black powder. 50 freight trains a day still pass through the Tehachapi Loop, making it one of the busiest single-track mountain railroads in the world. 150 years old and still working exactly as designed. If you are ever driving through Kern County and you see a freight train that seems to be eating its own tail, spiraling up a hillside like something out of an impossible drawing, that is the Tehachapi Loop. 10 train routes that push the limits of engineering, human endurance, and plain common sense. From runaway freights in California to railways built on the labor of men who never came home. From markets where you dodge locomotives while buying vegetables to bridges hanging over open ocean in cyclone country. Trains are supposed to be safe and predictable. They run on tracks, follow schedules, get you from one place to another without much fuss. But these routes are different, the places where the margin for error shrinks to almost nothing, where a miscalculated weight, a broken switch, a storm surge, or a moment of inattention can turn an ordinary journey into something much worse. And yet people keep riding them. Engineers keep running them. Because that is what railways do. They go places that are hard to reach, carry loads that are hard to move, and connect people who otherwise could not be connected. The danger is part of the deal. Always has been, and probably always will be. Next time you see a freight train rumbling through your town, or you are sitting on a passenger train watching the landscape roll by, remember that somewhere out there, someone is doing the same thing on a track that was carved into a cliff face or stretched across open ocean, or spiraling up a mountain that tried its best to stay unconquered. Trains are amazing machines, but the routes they travel, those are the real stories.